Hi everyone, I am Sarah from the Gettysburg Library and welcome to Chapter 11 of The Secret of Chimneys. Superintendent Battle arrives. So apprehensive was Lord Caterham of being consulted by George that he spent the whole morning making a tour of his estate. Only the pangs of hunger drew him homeward. He also reflected that by now the worst would surely be over. He sneaked into the house quietly by a small door. From there he slipped neatly into his sanctum. He flattened himself he flattered himself that his entrance had not been observed, but there he was mistaken. The watchful Treadwell let nothing escape him. He presented himself at the door. "You'll excuse me, my lord. What is it, Treadwell?" "Mr. Lomax, my lord, is anxious to see you in the library as soon as you return." By this delicate method Treadwell conveyed that the Lord Caterham had not yet returned unless he chose to say so. Lord Caterham sighed and then rose. "I suppose it will have to be done sooner or later. In the library, you say?" "Yes, my lord." Sighing again, Lord Caterham crossed the wide spaces of his ancestral home and reached the library door. The door was locked. As he rattled the handle, it was unlocked from the inside, opened a little way, and the face of George Lomax appeared, peering out suspiciously. The face changed when he saw who it was. "Ah, Caterham, come in. We were just wondering what had become of you." Murmuring something vague about duties on the estate, repairs for tenants, Lord Caterham sidled in apologetically. There were two other men in the room. One was Colonel Melrose, the chief constable. The other was a squarely built, middle-aged man with a face so singularly devoid of expression as to be quite remarkable. "Superintendent Battle arrived half an hour ago," explained George. "He has been round with Inspector Badgeworthy and seen Dr. Cartwright. He now wants a few facts from us." They all sat down after Lord Caterham had greeted Melrose and acknowledged his introduction to Superintendent Battle. "I need hardly tell you, Battle," said George, "that this is a case in which we must use the utmost discretion." The superintendent nodded in an offhand manner that rather took Lord Caterham's fancy. "That will be all right, Mr. Lomax, but no concealments from us. I understand that the dead gentleman was called Count Stanislaus. At least that is the name by which the household knew him. Now, what was his real name? Was that his real name?" "It was not." "What was his real name?" "Prince Michael of Hergoslavia." Battle's eyes opened just a trifle, otherwise he gave no sign. "And what, if I may ask the question, was the purpose of his visit here? Just pleasure?" "There is a further object, Battle. All this is in the strictest of confidence, of course." Yes, Mr. Lomax." "Colonel Melrose?" "Of course." "Well, then, Prince Michael was here for the express purpose of meeting Mr. Herman Isaacson. A loan was to be arranged on certain terms." "Which were?" "I do not know the exact details. Indeed, they had not been yet arranged, but the event of coming to the throne, Prince Michael pledged himself to grant certain oil concessions to those companies in which Mr. Isaacstein is interested. The British government was prepared to support the claim of Prince Michael to the throne in view of his pronounced British sympathies." "Well," said Superintendent Battle, "I don't suppose I need to go further into it than that. Prince Michael wanted the money, Mr. Isaacson wanted oil, and the British government was ready to do the heavy farther. Just one question. Was anyone else after those concessions?" "I believe an American group of financiers had made overtures to His Highness." "And been turned down, eh?" But George refused to be drawn. "Prince Michael's sympathies were entirely pro-British," he repeated. Superintendent Battle did not press the point. "Lord Caterham, I understand that this is what occurred yesterday. You met Prince Michael in town and journeyed down here in company with him. The prince was accompanied by his valet, a Herzo-Slovakian named Boris Ankochuf, but his equerry, Captain Andrassy, remained in town. The prince, on arriving, declared himself greatly fatigued and retired to the apartment set aside for him. Dinner was served to him there, and he did not meet the other members of the house party. Is that correct? Quite correct. This morning, a housemaid discovered the body at approximately 7:45 a.m. Dr. Cartwright examined the dead man and found that death was the result of a bullet fired from a revolver. No revolver was found, and no one in the house seemed to have heard the shot. On the other hand, the dead man's wristwatch was smashed by the fall and marks the crime as having been committed at exactly 11:45. Now, what time did you retire to bed last night? We went early. Somehow or other, the party didn't seem to go, if you know what I mean, Superintendent. We went up about 10:30, I should say. Thank you. Now I'll ask you, Lord Caterham, to give me a description of all the people staying in the house. But, excuse me, I thought the fellow who did it came from outside? Superintendent Battle smiled. I dare say he did. But all the same, I've got to know who was in the house. Matter of routine, you know. Well, there was Prince Michael and his valet, and Mr. Herman Isaacstein, you know about them. And then there was Mr. Eversley, who works in my department, put in George condescendingly, and who was acquainted with the real reason of Prince Michael's being here. No, I should not say that, replied George weightily. Doubtless he realized that something was in the wind, but I did not think it necessary to take him fully into my confidence. I see. Will you go on, Lord Caterham? Let me see. There was Mr. Hiram Fish. Who is Mr. Hiram Fish? Mr. Fish is an American. He read over a letter of introduction for Mr. Lucius Scott. You've heard of Lucius Scott. Superintendent Battle smiled acknowledgement. Who had not heard of Lucius C. Scott, multimillionaire? He was especially anxious to see my first editions. Mr. Gott's collection is, of course, unequaled, but I've got several treasures myself. This Mr. Fish was an enthusiast. Mr. Lomax had suggested that I ask 1 or 2 extra people down here this weekend to make things seem more natural, so I took the opportunity of asking Mr. Fish. That finishes the men. As for the ladies, there is only Mrs. Revel, and I expect she brought a maid or something like that. Then there was my daughter, and of course the children and their nurses and governesses and all the servants. Lord Caterham paused and took a breath. Thank you, said the detective. A mere matter of routine, but necessary as such. There is no doubt, I suppose, asked George ponderously, that the murderer entered by the window? Battle paused for a minute before replying slowly. There were footsteps leading up to the window and footsteps leading away from it. A car stopped outside the park at 11:40 last night. At 12 o'clock, a young man arrived at the Jolly Cricketers in a car and engaged a room. He put his boots outside to be cleaned. They were very wet and muddy, as though he had been walking through the long grass in the park. George leant forward eagerly. Could not the boots be compared with the footprints? They were. Well, they exactly correspond. That settles it, cried George. We have the murderer, the young man. What's his name, by the way? At the inn he gave his name of Anthony Cade. This Anthony Cade must be pursued at once and arrested. You won't need to pursue him, said Superintendent Battle. Why? Because he's still there. What? Curious, isn't it? Colonel Melrose eyed him keenly. What's your mind, Battle? Out with it. I just say it's curious, that's all. Here's a young man who ought to cut and run, but he doesn't cut and run. He stays here and gives us every faculty for comparing footmarks. What do you think then? I don't know what to think, and that's a very disturbing state of mind. Do you imagine, began Colonel Melrose, but broke off as a discreet knock came at the door. George rose and went to it. Treadwell, inwardly suffering from having to knock at doors in this low fashion, stood dignified upon the threshold and addressed them his master. Excuse me, my lord, but a gentleman wishes to see you on urgent and important business, connected, I understand, with this morning's tragedy. What's his name? Asked Battle suddenly. His name, sir, is Mr. Anthony Cade, but he said it wouldn't convey anything to anybody. It seemed to convey something to the four men present. They all sat up in varying degrees of astonishments. Lord Caterham began to chuckle. I'm really beginning to enjoy myself. Show him in, Treadwell. Show him in at once.